I'm Stan Altman. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, and it's our school that's the host to both the lecture series and the Lillian and Nathan Ackerman Chair. I think one of the nice things about this being the third year, it's now become a tradition, and we're right in the middle of a season when we have many, many traditions. And I think it's one of those traditions that are the kinds of moments that allow you to step back and kind of reflect about what we are as a country and what we are as a school and a people. I'm assuming, but I'm going to take a moment because it's always, I find it really quite inspirational just to remind myself the genesis of all of this. There's a nice little description about Lillian and Nathan Ackerman in our, what's now become a traditional invitation, but I think the essence of it are, here are two people who came to the United States under in some ways very different circumstances. Lillian came from Russia, having come from a small village in Russia, having experienced all the ravages of a country in which freedom wasn't one of the underlying principles, and struggling to find a way here, as many of our grandparents did, and to make a new life when she got here. Nathan, on the other hand, was here visiting with his uncle, only to suddenly discover with the outbreak of World War I that there was no place to go home to. And so America, in a way, by default, became his home. And I think the two of them recognized that America offered opportunities that they were not going to find from the countries that they were both born from and came from. And that in many ways, having been born outside the United States, they came to appreciate the freedom and opportunity that America offered, and the promise that it offered, and particularly the challenge that it offered everyone who was here to participate. And so they always felt that having come from outside the United States, they appreciated America more than, in many ways, those of us who were born and take for granted you can go to public school and you go to college, you have job opportunities, which for people who are born in many countries outside of this country, that's not true. And so in order to capture the essence and the spirit, and to just have that spirit live on in ways that serve as inspirations to all of us, the Ackerman Lecture Series was created by Erwin and Rosalind Engelman. Rosalind is the daughter of both Nathan and Lillian. And for the School of Public Affairs and for Baruch, I think this is an important inspiration because we deal with, as an institution, the City University, and as a school, students who come here from all over the world, who come here whose parents have immigrated to this country because they want a new life for themselves and their children. And we serve as a gate to give people an opportunity to find new meaning and opportunity to both quality of life and professional opportunities, at the same time that we're ever mindful that in spite of all of the important principles on which this country was formed, the work isn't finished. And so the series is called Equality and Justice in America, because it is a struggle that we are all forever involved in to make this country what we all believe it is, in terms of a great place for everyone who is here to find their dream in life. So it's an honor for us to serve as the host. It's an honor for us and a privilege every year to celebrate this tradition by having the Ackerman Lecture Series. And it's also an honor and a privilege to have as part of our traditional opening ceremony to invite Rosalind Engelman to come up and to share the moment with us before we actually more formally start the program. So Rosalind, thank you for coming up.
With the idea that the best speech is a short speech, I'm going to be very brief. I want to thank Stan for realizing all the hopes and dreams we had for this lecture series, and for Marcellus Andrus, who has been a superlative Ackerman chair, and one we hope will continue for years to come. I want to thank my husband, who made this whole dream of mine possible, as he makes every dream of mine possible. And I'd also like to introduce you to my daughter, Madeline. Madeline, would you stand up, please? All right. I'll tell you why I want to introduce Madeline to you. This morning I had breakfast with Madeline, and I said, let's have breakfast. She said, fine, but I can't stay very long. I said, why not? We can talk, we can have breakfast, you know, mother-daughter things. And she said, there's an old woman, and I don't know who she is, but she lives alone, and she has no food for the holiday. So I'm going over there with a holiday package for her, and I'm going to spend some time with her, and I have to be there on time. So I felt kind of good, because there's an old saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I'd like to tell you a story about the original apple, Lily Ackerman. And maybe it's the original tree, thank you. And it's a story about, it mentions in this text that my mother was a slave laborer in World War I. And when all material, all men, moved by cart, by train at the time of that war, and when her town was taken over, the children were gathered up to clear the snow from the railroad tracks. Now, if you've been to Russia in the winter, you know what snow is. And she told me of many children who put their feet in the snow, couldn't get them out, and they weren't thawed out until spring. Every morning, her mother gave her a hot potato. It served two purposes. It kept her little hands warm till she got to the tracks, and it was lunch. And the other children made fun of my mother because every day at lunch, she shared her potato with another little girl. And they said, why do you do that? You have so little. Why do you share this potato? And she said, because this little girl has no potato. So in that spirit, all of you students who are here today, when you are out of Baruch, remember where you come from and come back and share that potato. And now it's my great privilege to turn this back over to the Dean. Thank you.
I think, as Rosalind pointed out, we've really been quite fortunate. The other part of the series was the creation of a chair. The idea behind that chair was to bring in an outstanding scholar who could, in fact, not only do research, but be provocative about making sure that these issues really received the rigorous and intellectual attention that they deserved. And the first recipient of the chair has been Marsalis Andrews, who is the host for this evening's program. Marsalis.
I see so many of my students here. I will be brief. I have taken too much of your time already. George Borjas comes to us here at the School of Public Affairs at Baruch at an important time in the life of New York City. This, as you know better than anyone, is a vibrant, difficult, passionate city, full of migrants and sojourners, full of dreamers. It is so full of hope and so full of sorrow. And the city is full of so much. It's pondering its fate now, as it is once again a place where people come in search of their dreams, in search of the America we all wish it was. There are two worthy dreams, though, that are in conflict, and that are the subject of today's lecture by Professor Borjas. The first dream is the dream of an open door, of a city, of a nation that opens itself to the world's poor, that opens itself to the world's abused people, the people who stubbornly dream of making a better life for themselves and creating a small piece of paradise in their place and in the larger place that they come to. That dream is in conflict with another dream, the old dream of equality. Those two dreams are doing a worrisome and in some ways fatal dance now. This kind of distressing contradiction gives rise to lots of loud words and angry gestures. But you know, these angry gestures, these loud words of the competing factions, they are the tools of fools who would rather not think the difficult thought, would rather not think about the difficulty of somehow balancing and blending equality and opportunity. George Borjas is here to make us be serious about the terrible problem of immigration in a time of rising inequality. This man, this brilliant man, professor, the Frozheimer professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, has fashioned a very subtle argument that sweeps away the usual evasions and sweeps away the romantic myths of immigrant stories gone by. He will make us face hard and fateful choices that will bring some joy to some and a great deal of sadness to others. George Borjas will help us learn about the choices before us, thereby making us a mature and worthy people in a mature and worthy nation that agrees to strike an aching balance between justice and opportunity. These issues are bound to inspire passion and anger in this room. If we're careful and if we pay close attention, we'll be provided with the information we need to make hard and fateful choices that will ultimately promote the well-being of the city, of the nation, in the hope of making a better city on the hill. Please hear what George Borjas has to say. You can agree or disagree as you choose. You are not allowed to disrespect this forum, to disrespect this man, to disrespect the good people, the Engelmans, because you are angry. Your anger must have a stylish, slashing way about it, but stylish. Abuse, loud voices will disgrace you and all you claim to support. I give you George Borjas.
It will be hard to top that introduction, okay? I am greatly honored to be here tonight as the Ackerman Lecturer on Equality and Justice in America. It's been quite a while since I've been in New York giving a lecture like this. I grew up I was born in Cuba, but grew up in Hoboken, so I know the area quite well. And it's just a very nice pleasure for me to be here tonight. Thank you very much. I'm here to talk about immigration in the U.S. over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And I'm here to explain to you a couple of things, I think. One is to give you a few facts, because one thing I found when I travel and talk to people about the topic of immigration is that most people really have very little idea of the way policy actually works, or even how many immigrants come to the U.S. every year. So I want to introduce a few facts to you, which is why we have a little TV here. I could have brought a nice movie instead of the lecture. And sort of show you what the patterns are, what the trends are. But more importantly, once we know the patterns and trends, I'm here to explain to you, in my view, what these patterns and trends mean and what they mean for the future. Okay? And I found that it's very useful for me to start with a little anecdote of something that actually happened about 20 years ago. Those of you who've read my book know the anecdote, but most of you haven't read my book, so I will tell it to you here. And it goes as follows. Now, this truly happened. Jimmy Carter was president back in January '79, and he invited Deng Xiaoping, who was then the vice premier of China, a country that's now in the news again, to come to the United States for his very first state visit to Washington. And if you go back to the New York Times and the Washington Post of January '79, you'll find that that state visit was highly celebrated. It made the front page every single day, long stories about Deng Xiaoping, détente, and all the usual things that went along in those years. And Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping met a few times in the White House. And at one of those meetings, Jimmy Carter finally broached the topic that he really wanted to broach, which was the whole issue of human rights and China. We're still talking about that topic, but Jimmy Carter brought it up with Deng Xiaoping at that time. And Jimmy Carter had come very prepared to that meeting where the topic of human rights was raised. And Jimmy Carter had a litany of things that he wanted to bring up with Deng Xiaoping. And one of the arguments Jimmy Carter had was that, for China to join the club of so-called civilized nations, clearly China had to do various things, A, B, C, D, before it could rightly join that club. And in that list of things that Jimmy Carter wanted China to do was the whole issue of emigration from China. Now, as most of you know, communist countries prevented their citizens from leaving those countries for many, many years. And Jimmy Carter said, how could you possibly think of yourself in a liberal, progressive way when you prohibit your citizens from leaving? Let your people go. That would be what a human rights policy would imply. So Deng Xiaoping, took it very seriously. He thought about it for a little while and finally said, okay, Mr. President, I hear you and I agree. So how many Chinese nationals do you want? 10 million? 20 million? 30 million? And that was another discussion. Now, the important point about that is that by Deng Xiaoping raising that question, it forces the U.S., Jimmy Carter in that case, to basically face one of the two key issues that anybody who thinks about immigration has to face. And that is, how many people do we want? The fact of the matter is, millions more people want to come to the U.S. than we would ever be willing to admit. About the only people who participate in the immigration debate today who seriously consider the possibility of opening up the door completely is the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. Apart from that, nobody considers that possibility very seriously. So the fact of the matter is we're going to have to pick and choose. And the number will be an important component of any immigration policy. How many do we want? But actually, there's an equally important question that could have been raised at that meeting between Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping that was not. Because suppose that Jimmy Carter had actually thought about this for 10 minutes before the meeting and had said in his mind, we'd be willing to admit 10 million Chinese. When Deng Xiaoping brought the question up, Jimmy Carter could have said, okay, Vice Premier, we'd be willing to take 10 million Chinese. But then Deng Xiaoping could have come back with the following question. Well, we have 1 billion to choose from. Which 10 million do you want? And that is a second issue that anybody who tries to think about immigration policy eventually has to face. Millions more want to come to the U.S. than we're willing to admit. Therefore, we have to settle on a number. And then we have to settle on a formula of some type to decide who among the many millions we want to pick. In other words, how many immigrants do we want to admit? And which immigrants do we want to admit? And those really are the two crucial questions that dominate the debate over immigration policy today. Now, let me put it differently. Those are the two crucial questions that should dominate the debate of immigration policy. You seldom hear those questions actually raised in the debate. Instead, what you hear in the debate is a lot of arguments over, for example, do X% of immigrants use welfare? Is it 10%? Is it 9%? Is it 7%? In other words, we're arguing over a detail rather than over the two questions, how many and which. We also argue a lot over by how much do immigrants take jobs away from native workers? Is it 1 million jobs, 300,000 jobs? Again, the details matter. We still don't face up to the key questions. So what I want to do today is sort of illustrate to you some of the key trends that have brought us as a country to the point we're in right now. Explain to you what I think these things mean, and hopefully provide a couple of policy prescriptions that I think we should follow, and which you're clearly free to disagree with. Okay? So let me start at the beginning. This graph here shows you how many legal, and this is the crucial word in this graph, how many legal immigrants have entered the U.S. as long as we have records, which actually goes back to the 1820s. The Immigration Naturalization Service has kept a count, and we all know how counts go given what happened in Florida, but has kept a count of how many people are given green cards, that coveted piece of paper officially known as a permanent residence visa. It used to be green, it's no longer green, but it's still called a green card, in the last almost 2 centuries. And as you can see, there are ebbs and flows in the pattern, right? The last huge wave of immigration that we had in this country, and which most of you are very familiar with probably, and not just familiar with, but have a certain mythic, romantic point of view about it, is that which happened back at the beginning of the 1900s. A lot of people's grandparents came at that point in time. And as you can see, if you go back to the 1901, 1910 decade, that used to be the historical high in terms of the number of immigrants. We admitted something like 9 million immigrants in that decade. During the 1990s, that number will almost surely be broken. Now, I realize the 1990s are over, but the INS still doesn't know anything about 1999 or the year 2000, which is part of the 1990s. So we're sort of extrapolating from what we know happened already. So if what we knew happened during the early 1990s and the first 8 years of the 1990s continued to happen, we suspect it did, we're basically going to surpass the number of legal immigrants admitted in this decade of the 1990s. So during the 1990s, we admitted essentially 1 million legal immigrants a year. And that's sort of the raw number that one has to work with. Now, to put it a different way, not only are we admitting many, many immigrants, okay, but the fact of the matter is that the fertility of American women has declined over time. So in terms of how many new people in the country are foreign born in any given day, it's quite a large fraction. Of every 100 new people, quote unquote, in the country in any given day, about 50 are foreign born. So in terms of demographic change, immigration is playing a historic role, larger in fact than in the early 1900s, when there was a lot of immigration, but there was a lot more fertility by American women. So it's actually quite a big shift. Now, you look at the trends in this graph, there's a crucial pattern that's very important. Immigration reached the peak in the early 1900s. Congress reacted to that, it turns out. I'll explain how we reacted in a minute. So by 1924, the door was closed, more or less. That reaction, combined with the Great Depression, when nobody really wanted to come here in the first place, led to basically almost no immigration in the 1930s. Since the 1930s, you see the pattern going up over time, right? And in fact, accelerating after 1970, again, due to a change in policy. So let me summarize for you some of those policy changes, which are very important to know about. Before 1875, there were no restrictions, or let me actually put it more precisely. There were no federal restrictions on immigration. Many states actually prohibited certain people from entering. Like, for example, the very progressive, left-wing people of Massachusetts, as far back as 1645, prohibited the entry of poor people into their colony. Okay? The very first restriction on immigration ever on the American continent was in Massachusetts in 1645. But the federal government played no role in any of this until 1875. And the reason they began to play a role in 1875 was that the Supreme Court in the early 1870s decided that immigration was not a state issue, it was a federal issue. So all these states that have passed all these restrictions began to cry out to Congress, do something about it. We've had a law in the books in 1645 prohibiting the entry of poor people, and now the Supreme Court took it away. So beginning in 1875, Congress began to play a larger and larger and larger role. And it began to include a number of restrictions between 1875 and 1924 on who could enter the country. The restrictions included people who were convicts, political subversives, public charges, persons born in Asia, a general broad restriction. And despite all these increasing restrictions, immigration continued to increase, as you saw in that pattern before, right? Hitting a peak of 1 million a year, roughly, in the early 1900s. Congress then really reacted in 1924. In 1924, Congress passed what is now called the National Origins Quota System. And the National Origins Quota System was the first attempt in U.S. immigration policy to address those two questions that I posed at the beginning. How many and who? The National Origins Quota System put a numerical limit for the very first time ever on how many immigrants could enter the country. So it answered the question of how many. And it also answers the question of who. Who can enter? People with the right national origin. And the right national origin, as defined by Congress then, happened to be the national origin of people already in the U.S. Since most of the U.S. population was of German or UK ancestry, or British ancestry, that meant that two-thirds of the visas, two-thirds of the quotas, went to Germany and the UK. And Asia, of course, was completely prohibited from entering, from sending us immigrants. That system was in place between 1924 and 1965, as you can see there. In 1965, probably as part of the human rights, civil rights legislation that was passed, Congress decided to change the system. And it repealed the national origins quota system. It kept the numerical restrictions, actually increased them a little bit, but nevertheless, it changed the who question away from national origin towards what we now have, which is basically a system of family preference. In other words, we still have a limit on how many people can enter the country, but the who can enter is now given, it's not national origin anymore. The question we ask is, do you have family already in the US? If you do, it is very easy to enter the country. If you do not, it is very hard to enter the country. And even though Congress has increased the numbers over the last 30, 40 years of who can enter, there's actually a provision in the law that automatically increases the numbers. And it works as follows. Suppose you come into the US and you're married. Well, you just got a green card, and that entitles you to certain rights in terms of who you can sponsor. Because remember, it's all family connected now, right? So now you can sponsor the entry of your spouse. She can enter. Of your parents, they can enter. Of your siblings, eventually, once you become a citizen, they can enter. But if your siblings enter, that means that the day your siblings enter, what can happen to their spouses? They qualify too, as well as the spouse's parents and the spouse's parents' siblings. Somebody has actually done a calculation of this multiplier effect, right, of this pyramid that we created in the law. Within 300 years, believe it or not, the whole world will qualify to enter the US. Okay? Simply because of the way the system works. And that's why we see ever-increasing numbers of people entering the country, despite all the quotas and despite all the numerical restrictions. Now let me give you an idea of who it is that is entering under what provision of the law. This tells you how many people entered. In the last 3 years we have data for, 1996, 1998. 2.4 million people enter legally in the US in that 3-year period. Now, in fact, that's sort of a lie. Even though that's the reported INS statistic, one cannot completely trust that number. And the reason is that the INS, during those 3 years, created a queue of 1 million people who are already in the US, but who don't yet have a green card. In other words, if you're one of those 1 million people and you call the INS, they'll tell you the green card is in the mail. But it's been in the mail for several years already. They don't have the staffing to actually process all these green cards. So you might actually add like 1 million people to that number to get a correct estimate of what the true legal immigration is. Nevertheless, that's the reported number, 2.6 million people. Of 2.4 million people, sorry. Of that 2.5 million people, 1.6 million entered through this family preference system. In other words, they're either immediate relatives, parents, children, and so on, or more distant relatives, siblings. Now, to give you an example of the demand for these family visas, I actually looked up a number this morning on the web, in the State Department website. And I said, suppose I had been a Filipino immigrant who sponsored the entry of my brother 20 years ago. When would that brother of mine have come in? Well, it happens to be the case that he'll come in this year, because the queue is 20 years long for a sibling from the Philippines. So the demand for entry is just immense. And so we already have in place a huge queue of people who've applied to enter the US and who are entitled to enter the US under the family preference system. Now, the family preference system really provides very little filtering of who enters the country, and that will matter a lot when we discuss what to do about immigration. 300,000 people, or 10% or so, enter through what is called employment-based immigration. Now, before you jump and say, oh, those are highly skilled workers who went through that visa, two things to keep in mind. Those employment-based visas include not just the employment-based worker who got the visa, but also the families of those workers. So actually, the actual number of skill visas is pretty tiny. Not only that, the provision of the law reads in a way that a lot of those employment-based visas don't go to skilled workers at all. They go to unskilled workers. We actually have unskilled worker visas because we need unskilled workers. So again, very little filtering in the law as to what kind of skills one brings when one enters the country. About 10% of those people, the 2.5 million people, are refugees and asylees. Now, how that's determined is a political mystery. Congress and the president are supposed to meet once a year at the beginning of the year, and they come up with a list of names of countries for that given year. Roughly speaking, during that period, they gave 100,000 visas a year to refugees. Which countries are refugees, which are not, is a political decision, varying from year to year. All that is and one more thing, the diversity visas. A new component of immigration law called diversity visas. In principle, the law wants to attract people, or that provision of the law wants to attract people from countries that don't send us anybody. Now, the way that it began was as an amendment to the immigration policy in the early 1990s by Ted Kennedy. And guess which country got most of the diversity visas? Ireland. Now, the way, since then, that's gone down. So it's no longer Irish specific. But the way that that diversity system works is that, believe it or not, we actually raffle out 50,000 visas a year. Literally. We literally raffle 50,000 visas a year. And in my class in the Kennedy School, believe it or not, I actually know like 3 or 4 winners of this. So it's not, you see people like this quite frequently. Now, again, I looked up on the website of the INS, how many people apply for these lotteries? In other words, how many applications are sent in to apply? Well, there are very specific restrictions on who can apply and what the process is. If you send more than one application, you are immediately disqualified. So the numbers I have are correct single-person applications. Now, for the 50,000 visas, in the last lottery, over 11 million people applied. Okay? That makes it much, much harder than getting into Harvard. Okay? It's about as selective a system as we have. And again, that gives you a sense of the incredible demand for entry that we have in this country, that we have from people abroad to come into this country. In other words, it's going back to the original 2 questions. How many people do we want, and who do we want? We will have to pick and choose. Now, on top of all this, we clearly have a lot of illegal immigration. Until very recently, well, let me actually say that, let me reverse what I was going to say. There was an amnesty. I don't think that's my phone. Okay. There was an amnesty in 1986 of basically 3 million illegal aliens. And that was supposed to solve the problem. Because the political bargain that was made between the various factions in Congress was, yes, we'll amnesty 3 million people back then if we put in a process of employer sanctions. Now, all of you who got new jobs in recent years know that you have to fill out a form, the I-9, that provides some identification to the employer to prove that, in fact, you're legal in the U.S. And that was a result of that legislation. It turns out it didn't work. Because since 1986, we've been collecting more illegal immigrants. Now, until 2 months ago, if anybody had asked anybody who knows about this, how many illegal immigrants are there in the U.S., the answer would have been 6 million. Roughly, okay? Because that was more or less a number that almost everybody who studies this comes up with using a variety of statistical methods. Since the data from the 2000 census came out, as you've read in the New York Times, it turns out that they found many million more Hispanics than they were supposed to find, okay? So now all these numbers are being kicked up substantially. There are now a couple of academic studies, believe it or not, that more or less estimate that there might be as many as 12 million illegal aliens present in the U.S. So basically, we're now in a point where we're admitting 1 million legal immigrants a year, roughly speaking, legally, and another 1 million illegally, We're at historic highs by any measure of data for the US. Huge immigration flows, bound to change the country forever, and bound to be at the center of the debate of a social policy for the entire next century. So what has all this done? Well, one very important thing to realize before we get to what has all this done is that, living in New York City, you see many immigrants. I lived in California for many years. I saw many immigrants. Once you leave New York City and California and a couple of other places, you'd be hard-pressed to find an immigrant. That's the incredible thing about immigration. It's unbelievably clustered geographically within the US. And that matters a lot both economically and politically. This graph I just put up shows you what fraction of the population is foreign-born. Going from 1950 basically through 2000. Back in 1950, California, as you can see from that, was not a particularly immigrant state. But by 1998, a third of California is foreign-born. And that's before the 2000 census comes out. So when the 2000 census comes out, finding this million more Hispanic immigrants, I'm sure that number will go up substantially. The other immigrant states are basically New York, Texas, Florida, Illinois, and New Jersey. And they too have seen an increase, but nothing like California. And then the rest of the country, it's basically non-immigrant. Now that might be changing now. You see a lot of anecdotal evidence in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post about immigrants moving to Georgia or Arkansas and places like that, right? There's still no academic study of that. And it might actually be happening, but we don't quite know yet whether it's happening or not and to what extent it's happening. But an important point to remember is, to a very large extent, not only are we getting many more immigrants today than we used to get, but they're incredibly localized. Immigration really affects only, it seems, a very few places in this country. One other point to remember, before we get to discuss what all this means, immigrants today are coming from very different places than they used to come. Back in the 1950s, 2/3 of immigrants came from either Europe or Canada. By the 1990s, the number coming from Europe or Canada is down to 20%. The number coming from Latin America is almost half. The number coming from Asia is almost 30%. There's been a huge redistribution of where people come from. Now you might ask, how could that have happened, given the way the policy was changed in the early 60s? Remember, we went from a national origin system to a family preference system. And in fact, when people wanted to change the system, like for example, Robert Kennedy was called before Congress to testify. He was Attorney General at the time. And he was specifically asked, will the change to a family preference system change the number of Asian immigrants? He said, no, it can't, because only people who have families here can come. Will the change attract more Mexican immigrants? No, it can't. How could the predictions have gone so wrong? Well, Congress forgot two key factors. One is, by the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, people originating in Europe and Canada don't really want to come here anymore. Their incomes are pretty highest right now. There's no economic incentive to come here anymore. And secondly, Congress forgot to realize the way the family preference system works, which is once you establish a beachhead, you are now entitled to introduce more and more people into the country, right? Especially through the siblings provision. Because once siblings come in, spouses of siblings can come in, siblings of spouses of siblings can come in, and so on and so forth. And that is what led to the change. Now, I don't want to present too many numbers for you tonight. So I'm going to keep the numbers down to a couple of slides only. But this is one set of numbers I want you to know, because this is really at the heart of the debate over immigration today. And all I want you to look at is the last row. I mean, there's really very little need to talk about anything else there. Just look at the last row. In the last row, you basically will find how much immigrants earn as compared to how much natives earn. In other words, it's a measure of how well immigrants are doing in the US economy. If you go back to 1960, it turns out that on average, immigrants actually earned more than the typical native worker. like a 4% advantage. So if you saw the average immigrant out in the marketplace, he was actually earning more than the typical native worker. But as you can see, by the late 1990s, there occurred a huge switch in that number. So the typical immigrant worker was now doing substantially worse, at 23% wages advantage, than the typical native worker. Now, if you think about what has been dominating the debate over immigration in the last 20 years in the US, that pattern is at the heart of the whole debate. The whole debate, for example, over whether immigrants use welfare or not can be traced to that pattern. We're admitting workers now, we're admitting immigrants now who don't quite perform as well as they used to, in some sense. The whole debate over whether immigrants can assimilate or not, well, they're starting from a much lower position in the US economy. The whole debate over inequality. We're admitting workers who are now falling into the lower part of the income distribution. Are they having an impact on workers already there? So almost everything that we've argued about for the last 10, 15 years can be traced to that pattern. And an important question then is, why did that pattern occur? Well, it turns out that a couple of things happened in the last 30 years. Because of the switch in policy, because of the change to a family preference system where very few immigrants are filtered in terms of how, when they come into the country, asking in terms of economic potential or skills, it turns out that basically the waves entering now are relatively less skilled than the waves entering 30 years ago. So for example, 30 years ago, at the time of entry, an immigrant might not have been doing so badly when they enter the country. Nowadays, at the time of entry, a lot of immigrants are doing very poorly. And what that creates is a huge income inequality within the population, because it basically increased the number of people who are at the very bottom and who might in turn have an effect on people already there. And I'll talk about the effect in a minute. Now, not only that, there's actually some evidence also that the rate at which people grow, assimilate over time in economic terms, has narrowed down over the last 30 years. Now, again, these trends might not matter much if one could find, in fact, that in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, all these immigrants will basically race through the economic ladder and do very well. Well, that used to be the case, in the sense that people who came in the 40s and 50s did assimilate very rapidly. Unfortunately, if you look at the available evidence we have, that seems to be no longer the case. People still grow, but not quite at the same speed as they used to. So the fact of the matter is that there's been a tremendous shift in how immigrants do in this country. They used to be among the best economic performers, and now they're not. And that fact lies at the heart of the debate. One important question, which again, no numbers because I want to just leave you with the visual interpretation of this, is why all this happened. Again, I said that the current immigrants don't do quite as well as the earlier immigrants, right? A few studies actually trace that shift back to one important factor. And again, this might be the politically incorrect thing to say, but facts are facts, and we better know the facts before we proceed and decide what to do. Something that is going on, and that is at the heart of all this, is a change in national origin. And the reason is that people, about the best predictor one can think of for predicting how an immigrant will do in this country is to ask that immigrant, where do you come from? That national origin matters a lot because it implies a whole bunch of things along with it. It implies how many skills you have. It implies how you treat in the labor market. It implies all kinds of economic factors. And in that graph, I just show you a very simple scale of a few countries to show you the difference among people in the US. People from the UK, immigrants from the UK, earn 40% more than the average native worker. 40% more, that's a substantial wage gap. Immigrants from El Salvador or Mexico earn 40% less than the average native worker. We've created, in this last 30 years, huge inequality within the immigrant population because these groups are doing very differently in the US economy, And as I said before, these differences disappear very quickly. So we basically have a lot of inequity within the immigrant population. Now, it might be due to skills, it might be due to discrimination, it might be due to whatever other factors it might be due to. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of what is going on is a very important shift away from the more developed countries, where immigrants come into the US and do pretty well, to the less developed countries where they tend to not do so well. Now, why should we care about this? Well, this is a lecture on inequality and justice. And I think that one of the key components of the immigration debate is what these immigrants do to income inequality already in the US. And a key part of the story that is going to matter a lot, particularly in the next 5 or 6 years, is what immigration has done to the income distribution in the US. Now, the reason that it hasn't mattered in the last 5 years is because the economy is booming. We are meeting millions of immigrants, the economy is booming, there's no need to worry. At some point, the economy will stop the boom, perhaps, and we'll have to worry. And the reason we have to worry is for the following reason. One of the oldest questions in the immigration debate is, what does immigration do to the workers already here? Do they improve our opportunities, or do they harm them? Now, even though that question is very old, it actually goes back to before the US was the US. You can actually find incredible quotes by Ben Franklin regarding this very issue. Even though that it's a very old question, believe it or not, there wasn't a single academic study of this issue until 1982. In other words, a lot of theories, a lot of conjectures, but no data on this whatsoever until 1982. Now, since 1982, there's a huge literature that was sort of born in 1982 and that's sort of taken over almost an entire field in economics. It's just a huge literature, which unfortunately is very contentious and very inconclusive. Okay, let me tell you what the basic idea is, so you can understand where the problems are. The basic idea is this. Suppose you believe that immigrants harm natives. Then economists thought, well, maybe the one way to measure that would be to say the following. Let's look at cities where immigrants enter and see how natives do. And let's look at cities where immigrants don't enter and see how natives do there, and compare that. Now again, remember, immigrants cluster in very few places. So basically, the economist was exploiting that geographic clustering to get a rough idea of whether the cities that received immigrants harmed natives in a way that wasn't evident in cities that didn't have immigrants. 20 years have gone by. There must be 100 studies published on this, at least. If you want to find a study that says immigrants harm natives a lot, believe me, I can point you to a study that will say that and give you a table and a number. If you want to find a study that says immigrants actually improve native opportunities, I can give you a site for that too. And it'd be a huge positive number. There's a huge diversity in results that makes that entire literature almost useless after 20 years. And little by little, economists have begun to realize that maybe that question of comparing, say, natives in San Diego, where there are many immigrants, with natives in Pittsburgh, where there are very few immigrants, wasn't quite the right thing to do. And the question then becomes, why wasn't that the right thing to do? Let me give you two answers to that. One possibility that it wasn't the right thing to do is from the employer side. Suppose you're an employer, and you are now in Pittsburgh, and you see, you actually have like a sweatshop factory, making garments, and you see a lot of immigrants going to San Diego. What would you as an employer do if you want to maximize your profits? You move to San Diego. Take jobs away from Pittsburgh and move into San Diego, right? Well, that tends to equalize the economy when people do that. And even if jobs don't move, people do. Suppose you're a worker in San Diego, and you see all these immigrants coming in, hurting your opportunities. What should you do? You should move out. You move to Pittsburgh. And again, that will equate opportunities. And even if people don't even have to move out for that to happen. People who are thinking of moving to San Diego might move someplace else instead. And by that process, the whole economy is equalized. So basically, the way that economists think about this now is that perhaps this sort of cross-city comparison wasn't the right one. What should have been done instead is look at the national labor market and see what happens there. And let me just provide the last set of numbers to show you that. This is a national labor market between 79 and 95. Just four or five numbers. That's all I want you to know. Immigrants increased supply of high school dropout in that 16-year period by 21%. Okay? So a pretty big change in supply. In other words, immigrants came, a lot more high school dropouts. Immigrants increased supply of workers with more than high school diploma by only 4%. Again, showing you how unbalanced immigration has been in the last 30 years. A lot of immigrants in the very bottom, very few in the top of the distribution. If you look at the data on inequality, the wage gap between skilled and unskilled workers was 30% in 1979. Okay? Now, as all of you in this room know, that wage gap rose a lot in the last 20 years. By 1985, it was 41%. Let's just look at those four numbers together, okay? We know that over this period, the gap between skilled and unskilled workers, income inequality, is going up. We know that immigration in particular has had a huge impact on the number of workers at the bottom of the distribution and on very few little impact on the other part of the distribution. Any basic economics class that you've ever taken in your life, if you want to sort of have a nightmare, you can draw supply and demand curves in your head. And you can imagine how that can lead to some of this pattern of having more income inequality in the country. And that is what's happened. It turns out that 44% of that increase in inequality can be attributed to immigration. So to any of us who care about the worsening economic opportunities at the bottom of the income distribution, this pattern of increased immigration, heavily weighted towards the less skilled, could have had a very sizable impact on income inequality, widened it. Anybody concerned with income inequality in the US would be a fool to ignore the impact of the immigration policy we've had over the last 20 years on that inequality. That's as simple as I can put it. Put it another way. Let me ask two simple questions. Who gains and who loses? I've just shown you who loses. Workers who compete with immigrants lose. Because those are the workers that now see much more competition in the labor market. Those are the workers who will now have their opportunities hurt by by a bigger supply of workers competing for those jobs. Who gains from that? Well, if you happen to be an employer of less skilled workers in this country, the immigration policy we've had has been a tremendous economic boon for you. Put another way, immigration can be viewed as an income redistribution program. That's not the way it's sold to the American public, but that's what it in fact does. Immigration distributes income from the workers who compete with immigrants to those who hire immigrants. Let me give you a simple anecdote here, okay? When I lived in California, we lived in one of these very popular gated communities that they have in California. Sort of upper middle class community. Every single household but mine, so there were 32 houses in the community, so 31 of them had at least one illegal immigrant working full-time, living, basically a slave, raising the children, cooking, cleaning the house, doing all the work for these. You know, it's like upstairs, downstairs. You remember that show in California? When the community had a party, you know, when, like one of these block parties, it was really upstairs, downstairs. On one side of the street, you had all the basically white people who lived in the neighborhood having their coffee and their wine or whatever. On the other side of the street, you had all these Mexican women with the strollers. And that's a social economic situation in California. It is very cheap for upper middle class workers in California to hire full-time illegal aliens. And those are the beneficiaries of this. You go to the sweatshop industry in Los Angeles. Those are the beneficiaries of this. You go to those who hire farm workers. Those are the beneficiaries of this. But who loses? Many of you might probably thinking, look, immigrants do jobs that natives don't want to do. That's sort of the standard phrase that the Wall Street Journal would put down if they want to argue against me right now. Well, I would actually claim that that's an incorrect phrase to use. The phrase I would use instead is, immigrants do jobs that natives don't want to do at the going wage, which is a very different statement. Again, another anecdote. You go to California, you're hard-pressed to find a gardener who is not a Mexican. In other words, you would think that if we're not from Mexicans, there'd be no gardens. You move to Boston, there isn't a single Mexican around. The lawns are still green, except when they're covered with snow, but they're still green. And somehow people survive. People still have children. There are no Mexican nannies, yet people still have children. Now, it might actually cost a little more to mow the lawn, to raise your kid. But the fact of the matter is that somebody's doing those jobs at a higher wage. And that's the distributional aspect of all this. It's in that sense that immigration shifts wealth from the workers who could have done those jobs at a higher wage to the employers of those workers, to those who buy immigrant services. And that is at the heart of the immigration debate. The immigration debate is really not a debate over the whole country's better off. People try to put it that way because they want to claim it's something like that. But in fact, if you look at the aspects of the debate and the political issues in the debate, and who argues on both sides, it's a debate between those who gain and those who lose. So let me answer the question, who gains and who loses? On net, it turns out that the country is better off on immigration, as a result of immigration. The economic pie is bigger. Same argument as for free trade. You let in more workers, you globalize the economy in some sense, we are better off. But the point is, not everybody's better off. A better way of saying it is some of us are better off. As I said before, immigration redistributes wealth from labor to capital. How much? Well, there's actually a textbook economic model that people have used now to estimate the gains and losses. And this is what they are. Native workers lose approximately 1.9% of GDP, $190 billion. In other words, the wage losses, the wage reduction, if you add it up over all the people in the economy, it's not a trivial amount of money, it's some money. Native capitalists gain that because it's being shifted around, plus they also get immigrant labor that they can hire cheaply. So they gain $200 billion. And so the net gain to the country is $10 billion. In other words, after 30 years of immigration, after increasing labor supply on average by 10%, we have 10% of our workforce being immigrant. Basically, we have now come to a position in which the U.S. on the whole is better off by $10 billion that you can measure. Now, you could argue there's many other things that immigrants have done that are not in this calculation, and there are. You know, immigrant cuisine, for example. I love Thai food. That has a value. All kinds of things have values. To some, it might be a positive value, which it is to me. To some, it might be a negative value. But in terms of the economic quantities that you can actually quantify, it is a very small net gain. But there are these huge transfers of wealth going on from those who compete with immigrant workers, which tend to be predominantly less skilled workers, to those who hire those workers and who buy the services they provide. And that is what immigration is about. It is not about the country as a whole being much richer. It's about a part of the country being much richer. And if you go back with that idea and reread what people discuss, what people talk about when they discuss the immigration debate, you will see that a lot of the debate is really over distribution. It's really over that shifting of wealth that is going on in the U.S. economy. Now, let me tell you a little bit. Let me return to the beginning. As I said before, immigration policy has two components. We got to determine how many and which. Okay? And probably the best way to think about it is as a point system. Now, every immigration policy is a point system. Every immigration policy asks questions, and depending on the answers you give, they give you points. Then they have a passing grade, and if you pass, you get in. If you don't pass, you don't get in. Now, the US will never officially admit to that, but we really have a point system. There's one question. Do you have family? The answer is yes, you get 100 points. The answer is no, you get 0 points. Other countries have different questions. And one of the fun things to do tonight, if you want to get home and sort of think about this a little bit, is to get on the Canada immigration site, the website. They actually print out their questionnaire on the web. So if you want to go to Canada, they will say, these are the questions we ask, and these are how many points you get. Okay, and you can actually take the test on the web and see if you pass or not. So for example, they'll ask you, how old are you? If you're over 45 like me, you've had it. Okay, tough luck. So that already gives you a big no right there, basically. So they prefer people in their early 20s. They ask you, how much schooling do you have? Well, I'm pretty educated, so that will count for me a little bit. They ask you, what do you do for a living? They have 11 pages of things you can do for a living. 11 pages. So you finally find your occupation, economist. 1 point out of 10. Okay? Had I been a cook, maybe I could have made it. And you go on and on and on and on. And then they also ask you about language. Do you speak English or French? More points. Do you have family in Canada? More points. At the end of all this, you fill out the questionnaire, and you add up the points. And then they have a passing score, which varies by month, depending on economic conditions. So when they feel they have a shortage of some kind, they lower the points needed to pass. When they feel they don't, they increase the points needed to pass. Now, I do this thing in my Kennedy School class every single year, okay? When I actually bring the test into class, and I give it to everybody, and we all take the test together, okay? Half of us fail, including me, every single year. Half the class will fail, remarkably. Now, if you don't like the result, there's hope. Go to the New Zealand website. They have their point system there, too. I failed that one, too. There's still one more place to go, Australia. Oh, by the way, half the class fails New Zealand, too. A different half than Canada, but they fail New Zealand. There's still hope, Australia. Another website with another point system. I failed that one, too. And half my class fails that, too. The point is, all these countries, including the US, has made some kind of political decision of what the point system should be. In every country but the US that admits large numbers of immigrants, the point system includes something other than family. The US is actually quite unique in that regard. It includes only family. Now you might say, gee, that's pretty discriminatory. That's actually a very good counter-argument to the whole notion of using skills to choose among the many. And yes, it is. I mean, there's no doubt about it. That by definition, a point system is designed to discriminate. And I don't mean that in a bad word. I don't mean that word in a bad sense. I mean discriminate in the old-fashioned sense, to choose among different people. That's what every point system does. And so does the family system. Because think of the following possibility. Suppose you're born in the Congo. What chance is there possibly of you ever entering the US? Given that there are fewer than 700 people from the Congo living in the US today. The family preference system prohibits that, period. So every system discriminates. So one cannot say that one will be against the point system because it's discriminatory. It is just discriminating on a different level, on a different basis than the family system. Every system will discriminate. And that's a very important lesson when thinking about immigration policy. One will inevitably have to discriminate. Now let me put this up because this is very important. We've spent the last 20 years talking about immigration in the US, arguing over numbers, arguing over is it 6% on welfare or 7%, as I said before, or something like that, right? We have seldom argued over what is really at heart of all this. Remember, we have to address two questions, how many and which, right? But before we can address that, before we can make up our point system, in other words, we have to address two other questions. What is it that we as a country want from immigration? What is it that we want to accomplish? Do we want to accomplish political goals? Do we want to accomplish economic goals? Do we want to accomplish humanitarian goals? That choice will determine what we do with immigration, what point system we establish. And to give you an idea of that, let me give you an example. Most people in the US will see a fact that the New York Times reported and will immediately jump from that fact to some kind of policy conclusion, that that's what we should do for the country. Well, that jump is just incorrect for the following reason. Suppose I give you a fact and suppose you believe it. Suppose I give you the fact that, in fact, immigrants use welfare a lot. I didn't talk about it much tonight, but suppose they do. Immigrants use a lot of welfare. What does that fact imply for policy? Well, I would say really nothing. It implies zero for policy, because the policy implication depends on how you want to interpret that fact. Suppose that your policy goal, in other words, what you want to accomplish from immigration, is to say, I want to help poor people all over the world. Well, the fact that you get poor people coming to the US, getting on welfare, is the price you pay for pursuing that policy goal. And therefore, the implication will be admit more of them. That's the price you're willing to pay. Suppose your policy goal, in contrast, where let's minimize the burden on native taxpayers. Well, the fact that immigrants use welfare a lot would then imply something completely different. Would imply throw those people out. Enforce the law on public charges. That's what it would imply. So the same fact can have very different policy implications depending on the goal of the policy. And one thing that we have yet to encounter in the whole debate over immigration policy is what it is we want to accomplish. And the second question that we have to answer is, whose well-being do we want to maximize? Whose well-being do we care about? Unless we decide that, we cannot address and make up our own point system. And again, that's a question that we seldom want to address straight on, because it really raises questions of justice. I mean, that's really at the heart of what this is all about. Let me divide the world for you into three parts. There are we. By we, I don't mean natives, I mean we. I'm not a native, so I mean by we, I mean people in the US today. There are the immigrants who are going to come in, the lucky few we're going to admit with a green card, and there's the rest of the world. One of the key things that economics teaches you is that there are trade-offs. It is very difficult to conceive of a policy that helps one group without hurting the other group. Let me give you a good example of that. Right now, we have something called the H-1B visa program. Many of you probably heard about it in newspapers. Another way of saying it is a high-tech visa program. Believe it or not, we have a guest worker program for high-tech workers. Many of whom, by the way, are getting laid off today, left and right, because the dot-com boom exploded or imploded. But nevertheless, we've let in 100,000 people or so a year for the last 3 or 4 years with these visas. Now, from my perspective, wow, that seems pretty good. We're getting pretty cheap software engineers. You know, cheaper software makes Microsoft richer, maybe reduce the price of software for me down the line. But what is that doing to the countries of origin if we were to drain all their software engineers out of there? Is that really good for the people who remain behind? That's not so clear. Is it really good for us to attract every engineer in the world and leave all these poor countries, less developed countries, without engineers? That's far from clear. So again, we have to address that issue. Whose well-being do we want to maximize? Now, these two questions you seldom see discussed in the context of immigration. And there's a very simple reason why. Because basically, to address these two issues, you got to ask yourself, what kind of people are we? You got to find out what kind of country we want to be. And those are very hard questions to address. But unless we address those questions, we're really tangentially beating around the bush discussing immigration. We're forever arguing over numbers without ever really encountering what's really important about immigration. Immigration can be very beneficial in many different ways if done correctly. But to do it correctly, we have to address the key policy issues of what it is we want to accomplish and who it is we want to help. Now, given the facts I presented to you today, and being that I'm an economist, I would argue economics things should matter. Should they be the only things that matter? No, by no means they should be the only things that matter, but they should matter. And to the extent that they should matter, I can tell you the following. The economics of immigration would suggest that you can make a pretty strong case that the kind of policy we're pursuing today is the wrong kind of policy to pursue. We should move away from what we have now with this very strange point system with one factor, family, to a point system like Canada, like Australia and New Zealand, that asks not just family, but things like economic potential, skills, occupation, jobs, and stuff like that, language. By moving towards that kind of system, you could then increase economic gains to the US. By moving to that kind of system also, you will also reduce the pressure on the lower part of the income distribution. In other words, you would, instead of widening inequality, you could use immigration to narrow inequality, which is a very important point. So not only do we gain because we're getting more skilled workers, we gain because we get less inequality. And all that would take would be moving away from what we have now with a one very low point system family to a point system that includes family but other things. And that is the lesson, I think, that economics has to teach us. Immigration has distributional consequences. The kind of immigration we've had is not beneficial for the country, and it's not beneficial from a distribution point of view. It's widening inequality in this country substantially. It's hurt poor people in this country. And it's time we move to something a little more rational from an economic point of view. Now you might say, you know, the system we want will discriminate against all kinds of people. Less skilled people cannot get in anymore if you have a point system like Canada has. Yes, true, but the system we have now is no better from that regard. Every system, as I've argued, will discriminate. Given that we get 11 million applications for 50,000 visas, we're bound to discriminate. And since we're going to do that anyway, why not then pick and choose among the people to make us better off? And that's really what I want to leave you with. Now let me actually return to the anecdote that I had at the beginning today with Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter. One of the things that Jimmy Carter talked to Deng Xiaoping about during that meeting in Washington was an old piece of legislation from the Cold War called the Jackson-Vanik Amendments. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it was passed by Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson, a Democrat, and Charles Vanik, two congressmen who basically put into law the following sort of idea. If you're a communist country, for you to receive favored trade status with the US, you must let your people go, would be a good way to put it. In other words, communist countries who wanted to get favored trade agreements with the US had to have policies in place that, in fact, allowed their people to leave those countries. Okay? So then, and Jimmy Carter actually explained to Deng Xiaoping the whole notion of this policy. And that's one of the reasons why China had to let their people go. If you wanted to have better trade relations with us and favor trade status with us, the Jackson-Vanik Amendments prevented you from doing that until you let your people go, Jimmy Carter said. A few months after that meeting in Washington, Charles Vanik, of all people, goes to Beijing. Vanik being one of the co-authors of the amendment. And he was in a congressional delegation. So he was just one of many congressmen in that room meeting Deng Xiaoping. And you know, the people, Deng Xiaoping is brought around the room and he meets each congressman in turn, shaking hands. And eventually he gets to the spot where Charles Vanik is in the room. And they tell Deng Xiaoping, Vice Premier, this is Charles Vanik, Congressman Charles Vanik. And Deng Xiaoping says, Charles Vanik, oh, I know who you are. I know precisely who you are. You know, we really want to obey the law with the US. We want to have better trade relations with the US. And I'll tell you, I've got 100 million Chinese for you. And then he added, When can you take them? And that is the whole issue at heart here. We've got to decide how many Chinese, how many immigrants we want. When can we take them? Now? Over many years? And in what kind of fashion we're going to choose that 100 million from the 1 billion we could choose from? And that is what immigration policy is all about, making choices. Thank you. So stay here or...
Well, Professor Borjas said you can shoot at him as long as you don't shoot at the head.
Question. If you created a whole point system, you would really then impact legal immigration to this country. Given the numbers of illegal immigration, it sounds like what you've done is you've done the top of the iceberg, but you haven't solved the problem.
Great question, okay. The illegal immigration problem is really something that, how can I say this, that the U.S. could handle or doesn't want to handle in the following sense. Like I told you before about the 86 legislation that actually passed employer sanctions into law, right? There are so many loopholes in that employer sanction law that they basically are meaningless. For example, the way it works is you get a 99 form when you get a job. You're supposed to fill it out and bring some kind of document in. All the employer has to do is to say, gee, you brought a document in, it looks good to me, and sign a piece of paper, and that's the end of it. So an employer who wants to look the other way can easily see a fake document and ignore it completely. Now the problem is that that issue cannot really be resolved until the US gets serious about actually having documents that mean something when you get a job. In other words, you need some kind of identification to be able to tell whether you're illegal or not. We don't quite have that. I don't know if we'll ever have that, given all the libertarian concerns over identification. So that it's a problem right in and of itself. A less worrisome problem that people often argue about is people say, look, we have a border with Mexico. We're not going to fence it. It's 2,000 miles long. It's impossible to control it. And that argument actually doesn't hold much water, because it turns out that only 200 miles of that 2,000-mile long border is actually passable. So it really requires putting resources, a lot of resources, many more than we're now providing, into a 200-mile stretch in various points. Most of the other border areas are not really passable by people. Again, if we wanted to take control of that, we could handle it. A more worrisome problem, however, is the fact that half of the illegal aliens are not from Mexico. Half of the illegal aliens are from places other than Mexico who went to the US with a tourist visa, basically, and overstay their visa. It is very easy to come into the US as a tourist, overstay the visa, and then disappear forever. And that gets us back to the first point, which is that unless we have some kind of control, a meaningful system of employer sanctions, we cannot control the problem. Now, until now, the lobbies of industries that gain from illegal immigration have been very, very powerful in preventing any kind of meaningful restrictions and meaningful employer sanctions. Perhaps one day we'll get serious about it and perhaps we'll do it. But until then, I agree with you. It's almost, we cannot control the problem.
Do you think that I'm sorry, do you think a lot of these big industries that you're referring to might take off and go abroad if we reduce the amount of cheap labor that they have? You know what I'm saying? Like you're saying, like you had the example of them, moving from Pittsburgh into where the cheap labor was. Well, what's preventing them from going abroad? And
some will, undoubtedly. Some will, undoubtedly. And part of NAFTA, you can actually view NAFTA as a way of trying to trade jobs by moving jobs abroad rather than bringing people in, right? And in the long run, that might work. But don't forget, immigrants do two kinds of jobs. Immigrants do jobs where you can actually move the job outside, but immigrants also do what's called non-tradable jobs. They do jobs that they have to be here physically for. And to that extent, they still have an impact. So not every kind of job that immigrants do, like for example, the whole driving taxis in New York, that you cannot export. You still need people to do that. And many immigrants are in those kinds of jobs, which means that a large fraction of natives who could have done those jobs are being affected by that.
You know, it's ironic that you were speaking at the Ackerman lecture, given the way it opened, and we heard the story of a family who basically arrived destitute and did well for their children, and contributed a great deal to this country. In fact, if you look at the history of this country, we are far better off than New Zealand or Australia. And we are very much a country that's been formed by immigrants. You talked about attaching values to the discourse that we're having in this country. It seems to me that we have to value the opportunity we give to people and what that has done to the psyche of this nation and why it makes this nation the very special place that it is. And I may romanticize it as the child of immigrants who has done pretty well. I tend to romanticize that image, and I would hate to think that I would ever be part of pulling up the drawbridge once I got in. I wonder what value you give to the fact that we have traditionally been the land of opportunity, and that having been the land of opportunity, we have done so well, and the immigrants who come here doing badly at first is perhaps their children or their grandchildren that go on to make such an important contribution nationally and internationally.
Look, I'm very sensitive to that because I also have stories to tell. My family and I my mother and I came from Cuba when I was 12 years old, penniless. Okay, so I also have stories to tell along those lines. And I am very much aware of how what I am saying can be taken the wrong way. And I'm very careful to make sure that I specifically talk about the economic impact as opposed to broader social impact. But having said that, let me tell you the following. You appealed to the history of this country as a way of saying, look, it all seemed to work out in some sense. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we gave people opportunities, we gave people chances, and look where we are today. We're a better country than Australia and New Zealand. Just because it happened to work out in the last 100 years doesn't mean that it will occur in the next 100 years. And I'll tell you why. Let me give you 3 reasons why, okay? The 20th century, and immigration in the 20th century, was marked by 3 distinct events that clearly affected how immigrants did in the US. The first event was 1924. Immigration was literally stopped cold in 1924. That prevented a replenishing of the ethnic enclaves that might create disincentives for immigrants to sort of move up the ladder or to sort of assimilate more rapidly. A second important factor was the world wars. For better or worse, the world wars had huge cultural impacts on immigrants in the US. Let me give you one great example of that. In 1915, there were more German language newspapers in the US at that time than there are today Spanish language newspapers. By 1920, there were fewer than a handful, fewer than 5 German language newspapers. Why did that happen? World War I made Germans make a choice. And that speeded up assimilation. And the third thing that's very important is that the whole 20th century was guided by what I would call an assimilationist ideology. Public schools, the way people felt about the US. People basically, I mean, the melting pot would be the correct metaphor. The melting pot was a good thing, and it was a great thing that it worked. I suspect you will find very few people in this room and in New York City that would actually claim that anymore about the melting pot. Nowadays, diversity is valued. Nowadays, we actually have policies in place that not only value diversity, but actually encourage it. So that the last 100 years working, and yes, there are all these great stories of immigrants, okay, making it in the US, doesn't mean that because we're a nation of immigrants, somehow we can actually keep the same values forever. And let me give you one other little anecdote. If you look at it from an economic point of view strictly, one can actually argue that immigration policy, even back then, was very selfish. In other words, it wasn't that we were concerned about the human, the human condition that led us to open the doors and admit millions of less skilled people in the early 1900s. The fact of the matter is that the US had to build up a manufacturing sector. And for example, in 1918, Ford Motor Company was like 90% immigrant. Immigrants built a manufacturing sector. That was exactly what was required then to benefit us at that time. So it's not like we might have had different ideas of what kind of country we should be. It's just that what we needed then to satisfy our economic needs is just different than what it is now.
Well, I mean, the spirit of your talk has been, costs and benefits of different choices, and we just heard about one potential cost. But I want to also pick up on another theme about jumping from a fact to a conclusion. And the big fact in your talk was that 45% of the growth of inequality along one dimension is attributable, or we estimate is attributable to immigration. But we also know there are a lot of other things that have gone on in this country in the last 20 years that have contributed to inequality. We've had technological change, we've had other aspects of globalization, we've had a deunionization process, we've had the declining value of the minimum wage. And so you can look at that 45%, we could look at the empirical literature and say it's rather high, it's rather low, you didn't control for this properly, if you measure the difference. We could have that, but whatever it is, it's less than half. And what worries me is that we look at one thing, which I think has terrible costs in terms of a certain divisiveness, and we think that it's a cure-all for lack of education, serious worker training, worker justice, and worker right issues that would address many of the things that we all believe need to be addressed in the country.
Look, we can argue over the facts from now until doomsday, right? And never quite reach an agreement as to what percent that should be. So let me actually get over the debate over the facts. Let me put it in a different context. We have created a social welfare structure in this country that is supposed to distribute wealth from high-skilled workers, people who have money, to less-skilled workers, right? And if you think about every single program that we have in social policy, it's a policy designed to drive money in that direction. Now we have this other policy called immigration policy, that no matter what the number is, it's actually going against the trend of redistributing wealth from highly skilled to less skilled. As long as you admit less skilled immigrants, the law of supply and demand basically says you're going to redistribute wealth from less skilled to high skilled, to people who hire you. So it seems that if what you care about at bottom, and so let's assume that for a second, there's only inequality in this country, by having the immigration policy we have now, we're basically counteracting the impact of many other policies. Now, how much is counteracting that? We can argue over that. But it is going against the grain of what you want to accomplish with every other policy you want to come up with. And that'll be sort of the most valid argument, I think, as to why one should be concerned about immigration in that regard. And I agree with you. The numbers, one could really disagree with. I mean, as I said before, every number I gave you tonight is from basically INS statistics, except for that number. Okay? That's right. That's an estimate. So that's the one number we can literally debate over until doomsday. It's not clear what the right number should be, and we can argue about methodology and so on. But nevertheless, the direction of the number, the fact that less skilled immigration is going to have a distributional impact opposite to what you want to do, given other social policies, is, I think, undeniable. Now, you might say, in the end, I'm willing to take that cost because I want to live the American dream. I want to give the American dream to other people. And that's a fine thing to say. But at least you should know what you're doing in terms of telling people exactly what it's going to cost them. And that'll be one way to think about it.
If you look at this issue from a worldwide point of view, there are perhaps 5 billion people in the world, and maybe in North America or United States, Canada, and Western Europe, you have perhaps 600 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population, that have a very high standard of living, and the rest of the world way below. And the population in the rest of the world is growing at a faster rate. It seems to me that we could reasonably expect that the pressures for immigration, both to the better places from the poorer places, is just going to grow. And I guess I would feel that you're saying that we could easily control the flow of illegal immigration. I intuitively think that that's not right. Somehow, I think people from poor areas will find the motivation, they will struggle, they will find a way to get to areas where they can improve their lives, and that you will never be able to build walls high enough to keep them out. And I don't even know whether there is an immigration policy that one could contrive that can deal with that issue.
Look, let me put the example that you come up with in a concrete case. Mexico and the U.S. Mexico and the U.S. share a border, and that border is the largest wage gap between any two contiguous countries in the whole world. Okay, there's nothing quite else like it in the whole world. If you were a farmer, a peasant in Mexico, you can move to the U.S. to a manufacturing job and earn 30 times your wage after controlling for cost of living differentials. So I agree with you completely. The incentives to move are incredible. Now, there are two ways we can release those incentives. One is by letting people move, okay, or sort of winking one way and let the border be very porous, which is what we do now. The other is by investing in Mexico. In other words, by doing things that improve the economic situation there to relieve the pressures there. I don't think anybody has done a cost-benefit analysis of that. But I suspect that it wouldn't be very hard to come up with a good argument as to why it's probably better for investments to take place than for letting the border be porous.
Which is the argument for NAFTA.
Precisely.
And it's interesting to note that Mexico is complaining about illegal immigrants coming into
That's right. Now, they treat their illegal aliens quite differently than we treat their illegal, but that's a different issue.
Let me suggest we take one more question, and then we can continue this conversation in the reception in the hall right next door. So, George,
Oops, sorry. You've been raising your hand.
I want to come back to the issue that this gentleman raised about in your response regarding social policy. It seems to me when we talk about social policy, we need to look at it more in a broader frame than the frame of just social welfare policy. Our tax code is a social policy. Our minimum wage is a social policy. And we have a range of social policies in this country that I think do the very thing that you're suggesting the immigration policy does, which is increase the gap between rich and poor. There's a long history of that in this country. It seems to me that, and it gets back to the issue of the role of immigration in that, one can't look at it, it seems to me, separated from this broad range of other social policies, which in the end, I would argue, have a far greater effect on those issues than immigration does. We could solve the immigration inequality by paying people a living wage and requiring that people are paid a living wage. It's probably easier than closing our borders. And where the money would come from it would limit to some extent the wealth that is accumulated at the upper 5% or 1% of the economy.
See, I would argue that at least in words, the policy you mentioned, like the minimum wage, the progressive tax policy, at least theoretically, are supposed to improve the well-being of the less skilled.
But we know they don't.
Well, but the way they are formulated, they're supposed to be done that way. But the way the political system actually works is something different. And if you want to, one could take a very cynical point of view, which is to say, well, immigration is doing the same thing. We want to transfer wealth from the poor to the rich, and we're going to do it through immigration, like we do with all the other policies we have. I would think most people would not want to defend immigration policy that way, but people have. I just think that it is very difficult to justify the kind of immigration policy we have now, if the kind of country we wanted to live in was a country with less inequality and less dispersion. I mean, just put it a different way. Think of what a debate over many things in the US will be like in the next 100 years. We've admitted immigrants now for 30 years who have a huge disparity in how they do in the US economy, right? Some do extremely well, some do extremely poorly. Some of that will be passed on to their children and their children's children, if past history is any guide. We've basically set in motion a set of events that guarantees that we're going to have a very heated debate over ethnicity in the next century. And what determines these ethnic differentials? Don't forget, I mean, look at the debate we've had over the last 50 years, 100 years, over the black-white wage gap. The African-American white wage gap is nothing in terms of numerical size compared to the gaps we now have between, say, British immigrants and Mexican immigrants. And surely, almost surely will last a lot longer. So there's a whole set of events in terms of inequality that I think are worth thinking about when we discuss immigration policy today.
Again, the academic lecture series.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. By 9. We have time to stay here. Yeah. Let me just erase it. Yeah. I have it. I can email it to you. I can email